So in this video, we want to take a look at the descending motor tracts. So first, remember that you're going to have ascending sensory tracts. So they're going to be coming up from our sensory neurons, whether they are somatosensory, so coming, for example, from our skin, or whether they're visceral sensory, coming from our internal organs. If we want to become consciously aware of it, these sensory pathways need to ascend up to our cerebral cortex. But what we want to talk about today are the descending pathways coming from the cerebral cortex, which means conscious motor movement. So if we're talking about conscious motor movement, we're talking about the ability to be able to move our skeletal muscles. So that means that's the ability to talk, that's the ability to move, that's the ability to pick up particular objects. So we're going to do a couple of things. First, we're going to start at the cerebral cortex, then we're going to move our way down to the brainstem, and then down to the spinal cord, and then to the what we call the lower motor neurons. So when we talk about this descending motor system, it's a 2-neuron chain. So that means one neuron from the cerebral cortex to a second neuron in the spinal cord or brainstem, and then that second neuron will go out and innervate that particular skeletal muscle that we want to move. When you compare that to the ascending sensory tract, that's a 3-neuron chain, okay? And that's in another video. So where do we begin? Well, first thing is you can see that I've written up on the board corticonuclear and corticospinal tract. What's the difference? Well, there's many different types of descending tracts. Today we're going to focus on these two. The corticospinal tract, cortico meaning cortex, cortex of the brain, spinal meaning the spinal cord descending down. This is the descending motor pathway that tells your arms, legs, and axial trunk to be able to move. And the corticonuclear tract is more specifically involving some of the cranial nerves that innervate the skeletal muscles. These may include the facial nerve, glossopharyngeal, hypoglossal, for example. So these are some cranial nerves that innervate the head and neck that allow for conscious skeletal muscle movement. All right, let's begin. Let's do some drawings. Let's first start off by drawing a brain and talking about the motor cortex. Okay, so obviously I'm not the best drawer, but you can see that I've got a brain here, anterior, posterior, we're viewing it laterally, okay, from the side. A couple of things you need to be aware of. You already know that your cerebral cortex, which is the outer couple of millimeters of your brain, can be divided into particular lobes. So you know that you can have the frontal lobe, you can have the parietal lobe, you can have the temporal lobe, and you can have the occipital lobe. And they all have varying functions, some of which do overlap. What do I need you to be aware of right now? Well, first thing is, remember the grooves, dips and bumps of the brain. Gyri is the bump up, sulcus is the dip down. Well, there is a sulcus around about here. Now this sulcus is known as the central sulcus, and it actually separates out the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe behind it. So if there's a bump down here, that means there's going to be a bump up in front and a bump up behind. And we do have that, so that's going to be called the one in front is the pre-central gyrus. So the pre-central in front of the center gyrus bump up, and the post-central gyrus behind. Post-central gyrus is involved in somatosensory. It's sensation. We're not talking about that today. We're talking about motor movement, so we want to go to the one in front, the pre-central gyrus. That's involved in conscious motor movement. And this is known as the primary motor cortex. So if I were to draw that up now, you'd see that around about here-ish, you're going to have the primary motor cortex, and it obviously goes around to the other side as well. So I'll just try and draw it like that, obviously exaggerating, but it goes over and around to the other side. And I said that this is the primary motor cortex. But you've got other parts of the brain dedicated to movement. Well, you've got many different parts of the brain, such as the cerebellum, which I haven't drawn here, the basal ganglia as well, but we're not going through those specifically today. Primary motor cortex, in front of the primary motor cortex, you've got an area called the premotor cortex. Premotor cortex. And then you've got the supplementary motor cortex, which also goes around as well. The supplementary motor cortex. Okay. Supplementary. If I could learn how to spell. There we go. What do these three different parts of the motor cortex do? Well, the primary motor cortex is where we think up some sort of movement that we want to perform. So for example, it may be contract hand, or it could be contract finger. Usually it's quite specific, the primary motor cortex. In actual fact, the whole body is mapped, or at least the whole body that involves in conscious motor movement is mapped to the primary motor cortex. This mapping is called the motor homunculus. So if I were to take that primary motor cortex out and draw it here, for example, what you're going to find, so remember that's going across to the other side. It might be easier if I were to cut straight down the middle like this and were to view it from behind. Let's have a look like that. See if it makes it a little bit easier. Okay, so what we've just done is a coronal section, a frontal section. And so this part here is what I'm referring to here. That's the primary motor cortex. And there's a map of the body on it. And the map of the body looks a little bit like this. Here, most laterally, we have the larynx and pharynx. Larynx, pharynx, tongue, face, hand, arm, then it goes trunk, then it goes knee, leg, and foot. Pharynx, larynx, tongue, face, what that first is telling you is that speech, being able to move your head, neck, and head and neck, including those involved in speech, are going to be involved here, the most lateral aspect of the motor cortex, primary motor cortex. Then you've got hand, arm, trunk, knee, and foot. Now, this side, which for example is going to be the right-hand side, is going to tell the left-hand side of the body to move. This same homunculus, mirror image on the other side, is going to tell the left-hand side of the body to move. And I'll show you when that signal crosses to the other side. All right? So we've got a homunculus, a motor homunculus here in the primary motor cortex. What that means is if I were to get an electrode and stimulate here, the hand would move. If I were to stimulate here, the cheek would move. If I were to stimulate here, the tongue would move. So very specific, very discrete motor units of the body would move. This is different to the premotor cortex. The premotor cortex is involved in being able to do some sort of planned, patterned movement. So usually the premotor cortex, it will also have to some degree a homunculus map to it. But if you were to stimulate certain parts of the premotor cortex, it would stimulate a patterned movement. So for example, a patterned movement may be walking over to grab a cup of coffee, or moving my hand to grab a cup of coffee, or playing the piano, or doing some sort of planned motor movement, which means that certain muscles need to contract in a certain order. Okay? Let's take speech for example. Speech, when it comes to producing planned words, originates in an area called Broca's area, which is around about here. That's Broca's area, and this is involved in word formation. Now, this is important. This is part of that premotor cortex. If you were to stimulate a part of Broca's area, it would stimulate certain muscles to contract in a certain order in order for you to be able to speak. So if I were to initiate or stimulate some part of the primary motor cortex down the side here, which is involved in, again, all the muscles involved in speech, a single muscle would move. So maybe the lips would move, or the cheek would move, or the tongue would move, or the pharynx or larynx would move. But if you stimulate Broca's, they would move in a patterned sequence, which means that some sort of lesion or damage to that area results in an inability to be able to form coherent words. Okay. What about this supplementary motor cortex? The supplementary motor cortex is like a very old cortex, and it's involved, again, in some sort of pattern movements, but mainly it's involved in the axis and it's involved in movement of the trunk. It's also involved in grasping movements, usually bilaterally. So bilateral hand grasping, and they think that this has to do with back in the day when we used to need to climb trees, for example. You can see that certain lesions or disorders result in issues with bilateral grasping. All right? So they all work together, they all talk to one another. For example, if you stimulate the premotor cortex to speak, for example, it then stimulates the primary motor cortex and all those various muscles that need to be stimulated in a particular patterned order, and then that sends a signal down to those particular muscles. So that's where we're up to now. Now we're going to move on and we're going to talk about what happens once you've stimulated the primary motor cortex to innervate the muscles of speech, as an example. So now we're going to have a look at these corticospinal, corticonuclear tracts moving down. So remember, we've triggered Broca's area so that we can speak, so that we can formulate particular words and speak. Now this Broca's area, which is part of that premotor cortex, is going to talk to the primary motor cortex and tell certain muscles to be stimulated, or certain neurons that stimulate muscles, to be stimulated in a certain pattern, in a certain order. Now what that means is they're going to start to move down. So remember I said that the cortex, or at least the motor cortex, is the outer couple of millimeters here. And I said this motor cortex is going to have a map of the pharynx, larynx, tongue, face, hand, arm, body, trunk, knee, and foot. And remember that this side, being the right hand side for example, is going to stimulate the left hand side of the body to move, and the left hand side of the brain is going to stimulate the right hand side of the body to move. Now, not just by itself, but in conjunction with the cerebellum and the basal ganglia, which we'll talk about in other lectures. Okay, we've triggered Broca's. Broca's is going to specifically trigger the larynx, pharynx, tongue and face. All those skeletal muscles involved in speech, going to trigger them to fire off. Now, what I want to do as well at the same time is I want to trigger some of the neurons involved in moving hands and arms, because even though they take a similar pathway, there's a couple of differences, and I want to highlight those differences. The differences are those between the corticonuclear and corticospinal. So, in one colour, I'm going to highlight those neurons that are coming from the larynx, pharynx, tongue and face, and in another colour, I'm going to highlight those that are coming from the arms, legs, and limbs, for example. Now, what will happen is they'll all come together to form a tight bundle. And that means that what you can see here is that you have this nice fan-looking image here. It fans out. Now, this is called the corona radiata, which means radiating crown, because that's what the radiating crown coming from the cortex. And they form these bundles coming down, and you're going to have both those coming from those that want to stimulate the cranial nerves. Remember, the cranial nerves are those that innervate the head and neck for movement, especially the motor cranial nerves, and those that are going to innervate the trunk and the limbs. So they're both coming down. As they move down, a couple of important things. What you're going to find as we move down are a couple of interesting points. One is that in the brain, you know, part of the diencephalon, you have something called the thalamus. You have two, one either side. So they are the thalami. And then what you have is also something called, which will be around about here-ish, maybe a little bit higher, separated like this. This is known as the globus pallidus and the putamen. Globus pallidus, putamen, globus pallidus, putamen, and they're the thalami. Let's write them up just so you're aware. Thalami, two thalamus, globus pallidus, and this one is putamen. The globus pallidus, putamen, together with the subthalamic nuclei and the substantia nigra together are termed the basal ganglia. Now the basal ganglia is involved in movement as well. Specifically, it's involved in initiating movement, smoothing movement out, and damage to this area, especially if you have dopamine producing neurons dying off in the substantia nigra, this produces Parkinson's disease. Now we're not talking about that today. I've done another lecture on that. The reason why I'm highlighting it is simply an anatomical reason, because there is now a space between the thalamus and the globus pallidus and putamen. You can see that there's this space in between here. And I'm going to just highlight this space like that. So you can see that there's a space here like that. Now this is important. I'll tell you why this is important, because all these radiating fibers that are now coming together, they need to move down, they need to descend, and they descend through this little structure here. So they descend down between the globus pallidus putamen and the thalamus via this little structure here called the internal capsule. Internal capsule. Here's an important point between corticospinal, corticonuclear, is that the corticospinal, so I'll just highlight that by doing this, corticospinal compared to the corticonuclear, the corticospinal move through the internal capsule, but they move through the posterior limb. So that's the back part, okay? The corticonuclear, they move through the internal capsule, but they move through the internal capsule at the bend, which is called the genu. Genu just means elbow. So you've got the corticospinal moving through. Now if it doesn't look like it's very clear there, let's draw it here. You're going to have the thalamus and you're going to have the globus pallidus putamen. Corticospinal moving through there, and the corticonuclear moving through here at the bend. Through this internal capsule, descending down. So as it descends down, we're going to hit, now we're at the brainstem. So all of this here is brainstem. This is spinal cord. Now brainstem is made up of midbrain, pons, medulla. Once we get to the midbrain, we've got all these fibers coming down. Once we get to the midbrain, I'm going to do a section across here and we're going to look into the midbrain to see what it looks like. Okay, so this is looking into the mid. So we've cut the top off. That's the top of it, and then you can see the anterior aspect going down. So I've cut through the top. Once these bundles of fibers make it to the midbrain, if you have a look at the way the midbrain is separated anatomically, there's one part that I need you to be aware of in the anterior aspect, and it's the anterior third here. So if you were to separate these sections off into thirds, the middle third at the anterior aspect is the part we need to be aware of. So this is called the cerebral peduncle. So you can see that it looks like two little limbs coming down. So it's called the cerebral peduncle. And this specifically is known as the crus cerebri. So the cerebral peduncle are these little limbs. The crus cerebri is this particular area that we're referring to. And as we've got these fibers coming down, they enter into this middle third of the crus cerebri. And then what you'll find is they start to move down the medulla. Midbrain, sorry, keep saying medulla, midbrain. Midbrain, pons, medulla. So it goes down, and as it moves down the midbrain, it gets to the pons. All right. Once it hits the pons, what you're going to find is that these fibers start to fan out a little bit. They're not as tightly bundled together. And the reason why is this. In the pons, you've got what's called pontine nuclei. So you've got all these little nuclei present, and these nuclei allow for some of the neurons that are firing down from the motor cortex to synapse and then send a message to, remember behind the pons and medulla, you've got the cerebellum. And some of these fibers can synapse and then send a signal to the cerebellum. Why the cerebellum? Because it's involved in balance, coordination, tone, and proprioception. So sometimes we need to send motor signals there just so we can get this signal back to tell us whether we need to change that motor movement a little bit. That's why it fans out. We're not going to talk about that specifically here, because what I want to talk about now is we're going to ignore the corticospinal tract for a bit, because what happens is that starts to move down further. We need to talk about the corticonuclear tract, which needs to go and innervate some of the cranial nerves. All right? Now, the question is, what cranial nerves do we need to talk about? So what we're going to talk about now are the cranial nerves that are involved for speech. Remember, we stimulated Broca's area so that we could produce a word or even produce a sentence. We're now going to talk about the cranial nerves involved in speech. So now we're going to take a quick look at the cranial nerves involved in speech production. And remember, we're talking about upper motor neurons here. So we're not going to talk about what happens once these upper motor neurons that are coming from the motor cortex, once they get to the cell bodies or the nucleus of these cranial nerves, we're not going to go any further from there. Okay? There's another video talking about what happens when you fire off at the lower motor neuron going to the actual muscle to do the job. So I'm just going to highlight to you where the upper motor neuron finishes, which then speaks to the lower motor neuron in order for us to be able to speak. That is for the corticonuclear pathway. Then I'm going to focus on the corticospinal pathway and go to where it speaks to its lower motor neuron. Okay, so again, all upper motor neuron. First thing is, you know your cranial nerves. You know that there's 12 pairs of cranial nerves. That means there's 12 either side. Cranial nerves are those that innervate the head and neck, and there's one called the vagus, which means wanderer, innervates a little bit lower down, heart, lungs, GIT, so forth. So we've got these in order. Now, that means that we've got olfactory is cranial nerve 1, optic is cranial nerve 2, oculomotor is cranial nerve 3, trochlear is cranial nerve 4, trigeminal is cranial nerve 5, abducens is cranial nerve 6, facial is cranial nerve 7, vestibulocochlear is cranial nerve 8. I need to practice my Roman numerals. Glossopharyngeal is cranial nerve 9, vagus is cranial nerve 10, accessory is cranial nerve 11, and hypoglossal is cranial nerve 12. Okay. Not all of these cranial nerves are going to be involved in speech production. Firstly, not all of these cranial nerves are involved in motor movement. Some are sensory nerves, and some are both. So how do we know the difference? Well, there's firstly the easy way to remember these cranial nerves in order. O, to touch and feel very good velvet are heaven. That's the first way. And then the way to know whether they're sensory, motor, or both is some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter most. S stands for sensory, M stands for motor, B stands for both. Now what that means, first of all, is there's a couple that we can get rid of straight away because they're sensory neurons, which means they're sending signals to the cortex, not away from the cortex, which means it's got nothing to do with us. That's olfactory, that's optic, that's vestibulocochlear. Some of which are solely motor, and you can see that there, and there's a bunch that are both, which means they have some sensory branches, some motor branches. All right. Of these, which are involved in speech? Well, oculomotor and trochlear and abducens, they're all involved in eye movement. So we're not going to talk about those. They don't have anything to do with speech. Oculomotor, trochlear, abducens. What we are going to be talking about today, though, is trigeminal, facial, glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, and hypoglossal, all of which play a role in speech. So now we're going to talk about the fact that we stimulated the motor cortex so that we could speak. It's sending neurons down, and remember, it was fanning these neurons down into the corona radiata. These bundles move through this internal capsule, and now remember we're talking about corticonuclear only, so it moved through that bend of the internal capsule. It moved down. Once it hit the midbrain, it moved through that crus cerebri, that middle third, remember? And then it kept going down. And then I said once it hits the pons, it fanned out a little bit because some of these corticospinal tracts synapse with pontine nuclei, and they talk to the cerebellum so that we know where we are in our own space, and we need to tweak the balance, tweak the posture, and so forth. Once we get down here for those that innervate the larynx, pharynx, tongue, and face, so forth, we need to now find out where some of these cranial nerve nuclei live, especially those for trigeminal, facial, glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, and hypoglossal. So the first one I want to talk about is trigeminal, cranial nerve 5. Where do we find cranial nerve 5? Cranial nerve 5 is found in the pons. So what will happen is some of these will come down, synapse with cranial nerve 5, and synapse on the other side with cranial nerve 5. What you'll find with some of these cranial nerves motor, for example, is a bilateral innervation from the upper motor neuron. That's important, okay? Bilateral innervation from the upper motor neuron. What that means is if one side gets damaged, usually you can still use, remember it's motor, use wherever that particular muscle that it's innervating, okay? So most are bilateral innervation. So you can see here, at the pons, we're innervating cranial nerve 5. And cranial nerve 5 is the trigeminal. Trigeminal, remember, has those 3 particular branches, but what we want to focus on for the trigeminal is the motor part that tells the jaw to be able to move. So obviously jaw movement's important when it comes to speaking. Okay, as we move down and we get to the pons medullary junction, I've drawn that there, so the pontine medullary junction, so I'll just highlight that that's the medulla. The pontine medullary junction, that's where we're going to have cranial nerve 7, which is the facial nerve. And what does the facial nerve do? The facial nerves allow you to be able to move your lips and your cheeks, which means it can change the aperture of your mouth, and you know that sometimes when you say words, your mouth will be wider open, sometimes your mouth will be more close together. This aperture changes the way we form words as well. Cranial nerve 7, facial nerve, you can see sits at the pontine medullary junction. This is where it synapses with the lower motor neuron, which means that's when they come out and they innervate the muscle. That's in another video that Matt has done. All right, we've gone through trigeminal, we've gone through facial, glossopharyngeal, vagus, and accessory, 9, 10, and 11. 9, 10, and 11 are in the medulla, and they are lateral aspects. So 9, 10, 11. Now, the accessory nerve, which is number 11, you can have the cranial accessory nerve and the spinal. Spinal accessory nerve will start here, okay, and will come up and join the cranial. But we're going to just talk about the cranial, okay? 9, 10, 11, all on the lateral aspect of the medulla. I'm not going to draw it down because it'll get messy. Lateral aspect of the medulla. and they are involved in pharynx-larynx movement. Very important with speech, pharynx-larynx movement. Glosso, vagus, accessory. Number 12, we're up to hypoglossal. Hypoglossal is more of the medial aspect of the medulla. This is number 12. And the hypoglossal is involved in tongue movement, which we know is very important when it comes to articulation. So these are, so remember, starting at the motor cortex, we stimulated Broca's area. Broca's area allowed for firing off in a patterned way to the primary motor cortex of these certain muscles, firing in a certain sequence, coming down. The corona radiata, which is the fanning, moves through the bend of the internal capsule, okay? Moves down through the medulla, through that crus cerebri, the middle anterior third of the medulla, of the midbrain, keep saying medulla, I do apologize, of the midbrain, continues down to the pons, and then again, we're talking about corticonuclear tracts, and then these particular motor nerves are going to branch off and they're going to synapse with the lower motor neuron, which goes to the muscle, tells it to work. So that is the corticonuclear tract. What happens when we talk about the corticospinal tract? Well, let's just get rid of these cranial nerves. And we've still got the midbrain, pons, medulla, and then the cerebellum behind it. Now what we're going to picture is that this signals the corticospinal tract. Coming down from the arms, legs, trunk, it moves down, moves exactly the same pathway, except it doesn't go through the bend there. It goes through the posterior limb of the internal capsule, continues down through the midbrain, again through that crus cerebri, the middle anterior third of the midbrain, goes down, and once it goes through, again, like I said, once it got to the pons, it started to fan out. Then it gets to the medulla. So once it's at the medulla, this is the corticospinal tract. Once it's at the medulla, if we would now draw a cross section of the medulla, again, we're cutting across the medulla here. Okay. When we look at the medulla cross section, there's a couple of bulges that come out. Okay, these two bulges either side are called the olives, and these are called the pyramids. I'll just put P for pyramids. You've got this bundle of corticospinal motor neurons coming down, branches out the pons because some want to synapse with some of those pontine neurons to talk to the cerebellum, come back together, continue down, they get to the medulla, and then at the medulla you're going to find that the pyramids is where we want. You're going to have tracts here at the pyramids. Not the olives, but the pyramids, which means, I'll draw that in another color. As these fibers start to descend down, they go into the pyramids of the medulla, also known as the medullary pyramids. Let's write that down. Medullary pyramids. This is important because the corticospinal tract is also known as the pyramidal tract because of the medullary pyramids. And they descend down the pyramids, also known as the pyramidal tracts. Now, as we get down, bundle it up. Now, when we get down to the medullary spinal cord junction, something happens. What happens is this. This is finally where, remember, we've stayed on the same side. We've been ipsilateral, meaning the same side, ipsilateral, all the way down from the motor cortex to the midbrain to the pons. Now we're at the medulla, going down, and then once we hit this junction between the medulla and spinal cord, you get crossing over of about 90% of these cortical spinal neurons. So crosses over, crosses over. Now some of them will not cross over, and they just keep going down. So what you find is that 90% will cross over. When it crosses over, it's called decussation. That's crossing over decussation, and then 90%, and then about 5 to 10% are going to continue going down. Now what you'll see is those that continue to go down are at the front medially, anterior medially. These are called the anterior corticospinal tracts. These, the majority, are called the lateral corticospinal tracts. Let's label that. Lateral corticospinal tracts, and these are called anterior corticospinal tracts. Now, what happens when they come down? Well, I'm going to erase this because I want to show you what happens when they get to the spinal cord, more specifically. Remember, the spinal cord is now where all the peripheral nerves will be coming out and away for the limbs and the trunk. So this is the important part where they're going to synapse with their lower motor neuron. So what I'll draw is this section here and a little bit further down. So we're just at the bottom of the medulla, and now the rest is the spinal cord. And what we've just had is we've had all these tracts cross over, the majority cross over, and then some continue straight down and haven't crossed over. All right. Now, if I were to take a section of the spinal cord, let's just say around about there, okay? Remember, with the spinal cord, you're going to have the grey matter here in the middle, and you have the white matter around here. The white matter are the tracts, they're the highways, they're the pathways. The grey matter are where the cell bodies are, that's where they synapse, which means when these upper motor neurons need to synapse with the lower motor neurons, they do it in this grey matter. But where is the question? All right, for the lateral corticospinal tracts, what you're going to find is as they come down, they move through the lateral white matter. The anterior move through that ventral white matter. And when they synapse, let's first talk about the lateral tracts. They're going to come in and they're going to synapse with neurons at the lateral aspect of the grey matter. And you're going to see that these anterior corticospinal tracts, at the level in which they need to come out and talk to that muscle to tell it to contract, that's where it decussates, that's where it crosses over and goes to the other side and talks. This is important. Have a look. When you have an injury, if you have an injury above the side of decussation, you're going to get contralateral problems, opposing side motor problems. If you get it below the side of decussation, you get ipsilateral problems. Now, what do each innervate? The anterior usually innervates the trunk and the axis of the body. Remember, is there something I told you about earlier on about the trunk and axis of the body? This was that supplementary motor system. So most of those neurons that are coming, upper motor neurons that are coming from the supplementary motor system are going down the anterior corticospinal tract for the trunk and the axis, okay? The lateral corticospinal tract, well, these are going for that more of that fine motor movement. For example, the hands and the legs. Finer movement, hands as an example. All right. This is now, I should have drawn it in a different color, because what it's synapsing with is a lower motor neuron, which is not the topic of today's lecture. That's a lower motor neuron. Now what you can see is that the lateral corticospinal tract synapses at the lateral grey matter, and that the anterior spinal tract synapses at the ventral grey matter with the lower motor neuron. So what we've gone through is a fair bit. I've tried to condense quite a difficult topic in a very, hopefully, simplistic manner. What do you need to know? Take-home messages for corticonuclear, corticospinal. Corticonuclear tracts arise at the motor cortex. Corticonuclear tracts will descend down corona radiata, which is that radiating motor neurons, come together to form these bundles. For, again, corticonuclear, they move through the bend of the internal capsule, right at that bend, and they descend down. That internal capsule is in the brain, in the cerebrum. It goes down to the medulla. At the medulla, at the anterior part, the front of the medulla, there will be three different sections. The middle third, the cross cerebri of the cerebral peduncles, it continues down. And as it gets to the pons, this is where it starts to synapse with the lower motor neurons, the first lower motor neurons for those involved with speech. And again, I said those that are involved in speech, cranial nerve 5, cranial nerve 7, cranial nerve 9, 10, 11, and 12. All right? When it comes to the corticospinal tract, these are going to be those that are coming from the, again, motor cortex to innervate the arms and the trunk for motor movement, and they're going to go down the same corona radiata through the internal capsule, but this time at the posterior limb of the internal capsule. Move down to the medulla, again through the cross cerebri at the cerebral peduncles. Continues down, goes down past the pons into the medulla. Once it gets to the medulla, the anterior part of the medulla, the medial anterior part, which is the medullary pyramids, it moves through those, and it goes down the medullary pyramids. 90%, once it hits the medullary spinal cord junction, 90% of them will decussate and cross and become lateral corticospinal tracts, which end up innervating for fine motor movement, such as movement of the hands, for example, and feet. And some stay continuing going down, and they're more anterior, and these are called the anterior corticospinal tracts. And when they need to innervate the trunk, for example, and the axis of the body, they will decussate or cross at the level in which they want to innervate. And remember, these are the upper motor neurons for the descending motor pathways. I hope that helps.